Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here with my NACL week number 4 overview, analysis, and of course at the end, my updated power rankings. I do want to give a quick apology for this video being as late as it is. As you guys know, there's a ridiculous amount of games that I have to cover for this channel nowadays, covering all 4 of the major regions, covering the NACL. Sometimes I just have to get to these videos a little bit late to even remotely try to catch up, especially this split where everything was so condensed. The LPL is happening so much faster than normal, the LCS is happening so much faster than normal, and so there's just more games to watch in a short amount of time. I promise I'm getting to these videos, but I'm unfortunately going to have to get to some of them at least a little bit later than maybe you guys are used to, but that has nothing to do with the NACL. This week in the NACL was super fun. We're getting super close to playoffs. We're halfway through the split after the end of week 3, and so only halfway left to go, and that's really fun to kind of talk about. We're starting to get a good idea of the playoff picture and really where these teams are going to end up and fall towards the back half of the split. So let me know down in the comment section below what you guys are thinking about everything going on in the NACL right now. Of course, we'll be going over every single day in this video, going through days 1, 2, and 3 in scoreboard-like fashion, talking about every single series that was played, every single team. I'll give a player of the series, a dud of the series, and then, of course, at the end of the week, I'll give you my updated power rankings as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week for the entirety of week number 4. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it, starting, of course, with day number 1. And we kick day number 1 off with a really, really fun series of games. First and foremost, Team Fish Taco taking on Cincinnati Fear. And Fear are going to be able to take it 2-0. This team continues to look phenomenal. They've really been getting in good form as of recently. I think over the past week or 2, essentially going into this week, they've been really back into the groove of what we kind of expected Fear to be, which is maybe not the single best team in the entire region, but, pretty dang close, right? A top-tier team, someone who's going to be able to go up against basically anybody and look relatively good. And no offense to Taco, but they're not the best team in the league, and Fear should be able to come out and beat them, and they did. And really one player that I have to continue to shout out. I know I've talked about him so much over the course of this split, but in particular, he's been so good in this split. It's Shochi in the mid lane for them. He's going to get my player of the series. I mean, the Tristana game was awesome, but it really was the whole series for him that was super positive, and it's been the whole split for him that's been super positive. Even when this team was struggling at the beginning of the split, his laning was phenomenal. His ability to play off of his teammates, especially Perry in the jungle, I think is phenomenal. I think he's developed a synergy with JJ a little bit quicker than almost everybody else. It's just working for Shochi. He's just a really, really good player, and I think especially, we'll talk about APA a bit as we go throughout the week. Of course, I'm recording this on Sunday, and so APA has played a couple of games in the LCS at this point, as you guys know, but he was still playing in the NACL this week. I think outside of APA, it's Shochi, right? He's the second best mid laner in the NACL, and I don't even think it's really all that up for debate anymore. He's going to be a sneaky MVP candidate. I think if he continues to play like this, he really just has been that good. JJ and Manui in the bot lane were also really good in this series. Not to say that, Perry was not, right? I just think the bot lane was a little bit more noticeable. I've been pretty critical of Manui in particular, and I don't think that that's necessarily been entirely justified over the course of this split. He's been fine. I think he's given most of the time a really difficult role to play, which is the weak side, right? He's going to look a little bit worse when the rest of the team isn't performing as well in his role, but I think both of them stepped up here. Perry was good. The only negative I think you could talk about would potentially be Philip in the top lane, who was just kind of fine in this series. Lunacia had a really good series overall for Taco, and he's going to have those every once in a while. We know how good Lunacia is, but he was definitely better than Philip in this series, and, I don't think topside necessarily went in favor of Fear, but it didn't really matter. They had enough control in the map to really not make it all that worthwhile, but Shochi really was the guy. I mean, for all intents and purposes, he was the guy on Fear in this series in particular, and that was really fun to watch. And then for Taco on the other side, like I said, Lunacia played relatively well. Good to see him have a good series against a good team in Fear. I've been talking about how he's super inconsistent, or at least relatively inconsistent in comparison to other, top players of his skill level, the players that he should be compared to. But, he had a really good series here. It was just unfortunate that the rest of the team didn't necessarily show up. These weren't blowout games by any means. They were close, but it definitely was a little bit of a skill gap, in my opinion, on the side of Fear, who were just kind of better. Done of the series for me is going to go to Onat. Really feel bad doing this. I don't even think Onat's really been all that bad. He was okay in this series, but Shochi was definitely the better mid laner, and I think that was the lane that was the most noticeable. Another player I think you could give this to is NXI in the support position. Some of those engages on the rel just really weren't all that good, and it really didn't feel like he was super connected to the rest of his team. So a couple of players for Taco that weren't necessarily living up to expectations, but this was mostly about Fear being good rather than Taco being bad to me. I think Shochi has been phenomenal. I think this bot lane, when this team is winning, looks really good, and I think Perry is solid as well. Philip hasn't exactly clicked in terms of individually strong performances, but he's been good for the team overall. overall, and I think his team fighting is fine. I think it's just the laning phase that's been a little bit of a problem for him, but that's something that can be fixed, and clearly the rest of this team is clearly clicking right now, and so for Fear, I feel pretty confident that they're going to continue to be one of the better teams in the league. And then moving on to our second of the first slate of games, we had a matchup between Maryville University and Team Liquid Challengers, and honestly, this series was an absolute banger to watch, and it is a 1-1 split, which is super good for Maryville, who in my opinion has really only gotten better over the course of this split up until this point. I know their record doesn't necessarily look as impressive as some of the other teams around them, but they've honestly been really good over the past few weeks, and that really kind of culminated for me with this series against Team Liquid, who is, by all intents and purposes, the best team in the NACL. And yes, 1-1 is not 2-0, but being able to take a game and honestly kind of looking more dominant in their win against a team like Team Liquid, it's just really good stuff from Maryville. Player of the series for me is going to go to Get Back, and man, am I really excited to say that. I was talking about Get Back at the beginning of the split as somebody who was kind of underperforming. Honestly, he was my week 1 dud of the week, right? And I said I don't want to hound on the kid. He really, he's moving up to a different level, a different tier, going from amateur and collegiate into the NACL. It definitely is a jump, and we're definitely seeing that in some of the other players, and I wanted to make sure that he had time in order to get better. I didn't want to say like, oh, he wasn't good in week 1, he's not going to be good, right? And thank God I gave him that time, because he's honestly been phenomenal. He's been really good over the past couple of weeks. He was really good in week number 3 as well, and he's starting off week 4, going into Team Liquid and going into APA, who, for my money, and I think everybody else's money in the NACL, is the best mid laner in the league, and he really was the better mid laner in this series, and that's super duper good. Both games were really good. He was by far the most consistent member across both teams, and it's why he's getting my player of the series, but honestly, everybody on Maryville played really well in game number 2. Obviously, I've talked a lot about Odd Orange being a really big positive towards this team, Niles in that same vein, but Scary Jerry and Zyko in particular have really stepped up, I think, in recent weeks, and that's a big reason why I think the consistency of this team has kind of skyrocketed through the roof, as I think a lot of the ancillary pieces that we were a little bit more concerned about have really started performing well. I really like Zyko. I think he could be a really interesting player for a long time here in the NACL, and I think we're finally getting a good shot at that, but Jerry is just so mechanically talented as well. It's really not one individual player showing up. I think Get Back was definitely kind of the focal point for what Maryville was doing, but at the end of the day, everyone on Maryville looked really, really good, especially in that game number 2. If they're going to be able to keep up that form, I mean, they're going to be a really interesting team come playoff time, and it's going to be a top 6 instead of a top 5. And then for Liquid, I really would have liked to see them be a little bit more dominant here, but of all the teams to give a little bit of leeway to, I think Liquid is definitely near the top of that list for me. Dud of the series is going to go to Kim Down in the support position. I don't even think he was, like, awful. I just think nobody was particularly horrible in this series. It was between Kim Down and Bradley, in my opinion, who both kind of got outplayed by their alternates, but Kim Down, I certainly think, could have been a little bit more. I think especially some of those engages in game number 2 were just really not good, and that's super important nowadays. I know that scorelines can obviously get kind of bad when you're a support, and engaged support on a losing team. It doesn't necessarily always show the kind of impact that you have and the kind of aggression that you play with, but I think we've seen this before where Kim Down, especially in losing situations, can get a little bit over-aggressive in terms of the ways that he wants to go in, and I think that was kind of the case in game number 2 here. He's been fine throughout the rest of the split, more than fine. He's been good throughout the rest of the split here, and I'm not super concerned, but Bradley was also not particularly great. I definitely think that Niles was better across this whole series, and especially in game number 2. Again, Niles is a good player. I'm not going to, rag on Bradley all that much, but these are players that I think are held to such a high standard. Like Liquid in general, you're not holding them to the standard of being a good team. You're holding them to the standard of being a great team, and I think that there are times where they just don't necessarily live up to that, right? I think Arrow was actually pretty good in this series. Great positioning coming out from him. He was never really in danger, and he was dealing a lot of damage. It just wasn't enough to really push this team over the top. Again, I shouted out Get Back. APA was not as good as Get Back in these 2 games, and that certainly is a little bit surprising. I don't think a lot of people expected that going into it, but it is worth noting. APA is also allowed to have a couple of bad games here and there, and I think that's kind of what happened in this series. I'm not going to hold it against Team Liquid again. I still think they're the best team in the league. They still were able to take game number 1. I'm pretending like game number 2 was the only game that ended up happening, but they still were able to take game number 1. I just think Maryville actually walks out of this looking really good, and a couple of their players, their young players in particular, are definitely stepping up, the ones that fans might not be as familiar with. It's really, really good to see them playing well, and I hope that they can keep it up. And then you've got the matchup that I think everybody was really looking forward to on day number 1, and perhaps throughout the entirety of week number 4, Disguised taking on FlyQuest Challengers. And man, this is one I'm really, really excited to cover, because Fly actually is able to take the 2-0 series win. And this is kind of a trend so far with DSG, and again, I don't want to overreact, but they really haven't been as dominant as I think a lot of people really want them to be. There are a couple of performances where you're like, yes, this team is figuring it out. They look really good, but then there are other times where it's like, no, this team has not figured it out. They are not very good, and it's just really really, really weird to try and find a middle ground on where they end up landing. I think everybody just expects them to finish top 3, and they really have been pretty consistent throughout the split in terms of at the very least being able to take a game in a series, but they don't look nearly as dominant. And FlyQuest, who had kind of been on a rough stretch as of late, really showed up in this series. Player of the series for me is very happily going to go to Spirax in the mid lane. Man, I've been waiting for a really good performance from Spirax against a good team, and this was it. I mean, he was phenomenal across this whole series, going into a player in Young that I don't think really gives over resources all that easily, right? He's not someone that you can just win against very, very easily. Spirax was better by a lot, and it's really, really good to see. Him and Yuji feel like they were on the same page in this series, and doing that against a team like DSG that is very coordinated, I would argue, between a lot of their pieces. It's just really, really good to see. I've been kind of, I don't want to say complaining, but I've been talking about Spirax not necessarily living up to the billing so far in 2023, whether that be in spring or in summer, but these are the kinds of performances that we all like really wanted to see and really kind of expected out of him going into the year. Really good to get that here. Yuji continues to be a massive positive for this team. He's having a hell of a split, like an MVP caliber split. I know there's only so many people that can be considered in that role, but Yuji definitely has to at the very least be in the conversation. I think he's probably been the best player on FlyQuest, certainly the most influential in my opinion. And then Faisal was also really good. This was one of his better series on FlyQuest. He's kind of struggled, I think, to integrate himself into the team. His laning has felt a little bit less, I would say, proactive than it did on Fear last split, but I think he's also getting significantly less resources, so that's something to keep in mind. But he was pretty good in this series, was definitely better than Fake God, which is a surprise. Fake God has been pretty phenomenal, basically in every series up until this point, and I think Faisal genuinely just outplayed him in this series, so good stuff coming in from the top side of the map. Not that Masu and Winsome were bad at all on the bot side of the map. They were more than fine, and they were more than positive overall for this team, but I think a lot of the focus ended up being on the top side of the map, and I think they definitely delivered. And then for DSG, when do you start to get concerned? That's the real question, is when does it start becoming concerning that this team drops random games here and there a lot? Like, this is not something that Cloud9 did last split, which I know is kind of the comparison for DSG because they have 3 of the members of that team, but this is not really their performance. This honestly reminds me a ton of Dignitas challengers, except for the fact that Dignitas didn't lose Series 2-0. Like, they weren't dropping Series 2-0, they were tying everybody basically for no reason, and then they finally got their shit together, and Sanity really started stepping up again, and they were winning again, and it's like, okay, great, but I don't know if I believe that that's kind of the trajectory that DSG is on at the current moment. Hopefully they can figure it out, but my dud of the series is going to go to Meech in the bot lane, who I've talked about a lot on this channel. I think can be relatively inconsistent. That Kog'Maw game in game number 1 was not particularly good. He was just really aggressive and honestly got taken advantage of a lot by the enemy team, and so something to keep out for. He really wasn't all that bad throughout the entire series, but I don't really think anybody got bodied in like a very considerable way. I think Fake God was also definitely outclassed in the top side, but again, that's something that I definitely don't expect to be a recurring theme. He's been the best player undisguised, I think, for pretty much everybody's money throughout the year. He's been phenomenal in LCS caliber top laner. He's allowed to have a bad series every once in a while, but, you know, Meech not playing all that well, I think is definitely concerning, and then the rest of this team giving over resources. Tomio has kind of reverted back to being more inconsistent like he was on Evil Geniuses, rather than what he was on Cloud9, and I think Young has certainly had a couple of really good games, but can also kind of go invisible at times, especially on carries, and you know, I really do like Zazel, and I really do like Meech, and I think that bot lane can be solid, but again, inconsistencies have plagued Meech throughout his entire career, and I think that it continues to be the case. He's so mechanically talented, but he needs to be able to put it together against every team on every game before I feel really confident, and so for DSG, I think they're fine. I don't really know where to end up ranking them right now. You know, obviously they're not as good as Fly. Fly ended up coming out and just being better than them in this series, but, you know, it's going to be interesting to see where they move on from here. But for Fly, I think they're very, very good. Obviously, this team has struggled quite a bit, but I honestly had a lot of faith that they were going to be able to figure it out, because a lot of the players that were struggling, I think I had expectations of them being able to kind of get back on track. Spirax was the one I was actually concerned about, and this series kind of proved to me that he had, you know, the Spirax that we all kind of fell in love with last year is definitely still there, and so really excited to see where this team moves moving forward. And then moving on to our second of the second slate of games here, we had Supernova taking on Wildcard Gaming, and maybe a little bit surprisingly, we had a 1-1 split here. Wildcard had been on fire leading up to this. They're actually, I believe, in the top 4 in terms of the standings. They've been in the top 4 in terms of my power rankings. A lot of the players on this team have really stepped up and been really good over the course of this split, but Supernova looking okay in this series, and I think that's a good sign. A team that's really trying to hang on to its playoff hopes at the current moment. I think definitely in that game 2, you're excited about their ability to play through through their main carry player. And I'll talk about that now because player of the series is going to go to Quacker in the top lane. And this is almost exclusively for that game number 2 on the Olaf, where he just completely and utterly took over. He honestly wasn't awful in game 1, but he certainly wasn't like great in game number 1. He kind of got beat on the other side of the map by Zamudo, but man, game number 2 was just so dominant. It was so much better than what anybody else showed in this series really at all, that I had no choice but to give Quacker my player of the series. I've been so impressed with Quacker over the course of this split. I went into this split honestly being like, I don't really know all that much about him. The tape that I've seen of him, you know, when he was playing with AoE, was just kind of meh, right? Like, I wasn't super sold on him. I went back and watched a few more things, and I was like, he's going to be all right, but I don't necessarily believe in him to, like, break through, especially amongst a lot of the other crazy top lane prospects here. But I was completely wrong about that. The dude has been phenomenal, like, the best player on Supernova by a large margin, in my opinion. And he continues to be really good. He's a win condition that they can consistently play around, and I think pretty much every time they do, and, you know, they give him resources and they let him kind of go to work, he definitely pays it off by being one of the more interesting top laners in the entire league. So, good stuff from Quacker. I'm not going to say that's where a lot of the positives for Supernova end, because I do think they played well in game number 1, or in game number 2, I should say, but I think that's really where a lot of the consistent positives for Supernova ends. My dud of the series is going to go to Robbie Bob in the mid lane, and honestly, I hate to say it, I've really just not been all that impressed again with Robbie Bob and his time in the NACL. I wasn't impressed with him in spring when he was filling in on Evil Geniuses, and I really have not been impressed with him in summer. I like Robbie Bob. I love watching him in collegiate. He was super good, obviously, was the collegiate championship finals MVP, which was super fun to watch, and he was great across that entire tournament and in that finals, but it just hasn't translated to the NACL for me. He feels like he's consistently down in CS and lane, and he's not really making as much of an impact on the map as a lot of the other mid laners, which is just, it's a crazy strong position in the NACL right now. And so, you know, maybe he can figure it out, right? Like, he's still got plenty of time. There's nobody in the NACL that I'm just counting out, that I'm saying is done, is never going to be able to figure it out, but it's just unfortunate that it hasn't exactly been the best start to the split, in my opinion, for Robbie Bob, but I would say Quacker is definitely making up for it. I do think that Music has shown some interesting things. Sketch and Trevor have been all right. I'm souring on them a little bit, especially in the recent weeks, but I think they have enough talent to be able to win games. It's just going to be interesting to see if it's enough to push them over the top. But then you got Wildcard on the other side, and this team is still good. I wish they would have won both of the games in this series. I think that would have made me feel better, but their main core, I think, still played really, really well here. I almost gave player of the series to Keel in the jungle. I thought he was really good again, and man, am I so high on Keel as a player, and you can't deny it anymore. I know a lot of people said that it was just the champion pool and that he couldn't really play standard champions, but he's been able to pull out basically everything and be one of the best junglers in the NACL. He's been phenomenal for Wildcard, and in my opinion, he's the biggest reason why this team is competing above the pay grade that I think a lot of people expected them to be competing at going into this split. They've been a lot of fun to watch, and Keel is a phenomenal player. Saligo and Lens also really stepped up in this series. Talked about Robbie Bob not necessarily, you know, having control of the mid lane. A lot of that is Saligo playing well. He's played well all year long. He's basically played well every time he's had an opportunity here in Tier 2 in North America. And then Lens had another good series as well. A couple of inconsistencies, I would say, with Lens's game, but for the most part, I think he's just a good AD carry at this level, and especially with this team winning, he can be a really good force towards the back half of games, and so Wildcard's just a really fun team to watch. I think they do so many things right. They're super interesting. There are a couple of things to point out. Zamudo was good in game 1, but he got run over in game number 2. It's going to happen every once in a while, especially in the top lane, going into a player like Quacker, but, you know, this just kind of highlights the fact that I think Zamudo's more eclectic playstyle, his more feast or famine playstyle, isn't always going to be a positive for this team. It was actually very similar to me to what Moose Hater was offering them in spring. Moose Hater obviously had so many cool, really good games on, you know, champions like Garen and, you know, a lot of the things that he got famous for, but when he had to play something a little bit more standard, or when he would just have a bad game every once in a while, it would be a little bit more concerning. So that's something to keep in mind, but both of these teams splitting 1-1 I think is okay. Wildcard definitely would have probably preferred to have won this series, but I think their players played well, and then for Supernova, Quacker looks like a monster. It's just about whether or not the rest of the team can continue to step up. And then moving on to the final series of day number 1, and it was a good one between AoE Gold and Evil Geniuses challengers that AoE Gold was able to take 2-0. Good win for them. Really excited to see them continue to play well. It feels like this team has been inconsistently fine throughout the split. There have been times where this team has looked good, and obviously the combination of players seems like it would be really good on paper, but it really just hasn't come together, especially in recent weeks. I think I had them at number 9 in my power rankings going into this, and they're definitely a candidate to be a bottom 2 team and to not make playoffs, so to see them be able to come out and just like beat Evil Geniuses is really good. We'll talk about EG in a bit. Of course, this team continues their freefall, inconsistent slide that they will never be able to break as an organization, I guess, but for AoE, honestly, they looked pretty good in this one, and there really isn't a lot of negatives that I can give them. Player of the series for me, I'm going to give it to Will. I know a lot of people want to give it to either Darkwings or to Lynx because they were a little bit more of the damage carries, but I thought Will did a phenomenal job of setting everybody up in this series, and Will's just a player that I think continuously looks phenomenal when he actually gets to play his role for AoE here. He's just a really, really good player, and honestly, he has entered this team and immediately picked up right where he left off when he left on 100 Thieves, last year, and so really, really like what we see from him. He continues to look like a player who's going to really succeed at the LCS level if you just give him, I don't know, by the end of this split, right? He could be a player that I think next year an LCS team could absolutely start in the jungle position, and I think could do really, really well. He was far from the only player to play well on this team, but I think he's the player that goes under the radar the most somehow, even though he's Will. He's really freaking good. Darkwings and Lynx were also really good. Darkwings in particular, I think, played off of Will very well in this series. That was something we were all kind of looking forward to at the beginning of the year, was potentially those two coming together and being a really big positive factor for AoE. Hasn't necessarily happened. There have been games where Will has been good, there have been games where Darkwings has been good, and there have been games where both of them have been good, but it's very rarely because of one another. It just feels like they're good players, and I think Darkwings has generally had a little bit of a slower split than he had at any point last split, and so it hasn't exactly been the best of, I guess, introductions for both of them to playing with each other, but I think this series definitely showed some of the upside that can be there with these two. They're just so talented, and so if they can get on the same page a little bit more than what they had been at the beginning of the year, I think that can be solid. Lynx continues to be a more than capable ADC, and I really like Breezy as a support, and I think those two continue to be really positive in terms of the bot lane. I think in general, this team is just fine, right? I didn't mention Concept, but Concept is Concept. We know what he is. He's fine. He's going to be able to survive, and as long as he's able to survive, the rest of that team is going to be a positive, and so for AoE, there is a universe in which they still end up number 6 in the standings at the end of the split. I didn't necessarily see it in the previous couple of weeks, but it's good to see this win to kind of, elevate them in my eyes. And then for Evil Geniuses, I'm just so apathetic about this team at this point. There really is nothing else that you can tell me about them that I feel good about. I actually do really like King. I think King is still a really good player. He's the one player that I'm going to hang on to when it comes to EG. I think he's definitely more than good enough to be on a team that's better than this, but, I'm pretty much out on everybody else, which is super unfortunate to say. Done of the series for me is going to go to Ryoma. I know that, there's the conversation about whether or not Ryoma is good for Evil Geniuses. I think I'm starting to lean towards the answer to that being no. I still like Ryoma as a player, and I think he could be really good at the NACL level, but I understand why this roster in particular maybe doesn't necessarily need him. I think he's got crazy good upside, and honestly, in 75% of the games this split, he's been more than fine, and especially in their losses, he usually looks good, but this series was bad, and he's going to have bad series. He's just inconsistent as a player, and this was just another example of that. Smoothie also continues to play bad. We knew that going into the split. He looked all right through, I think, the beginning couple of weeks, because I think King looked really good, and their lanes were just pretty solid, but Smoothie's just not a very good team fighter anymore, and I think that definitely is coming into kind of fruition, if you will, in this one. I don't think anybody else played particularly bad. Like I said, King was good. Shaden is such an interesting player because sometimes he absolutely dominates and sometimes he just completely runs it down. Super talented, but just can't put it together for an extended period of time. And then it's worth noting that Surdy did make his split debut here for Evil Geniuses, as we talked about. At the end of last week, Soul was stepping down, wasn't going to be playing for Evil Geniuses anymore. Totally respectable decision. Work on yourself, and, real life obviously comes first over the NACL, but Surdy's going to be the one that's stepping in. Obviously played for EG last year, but played for Team Liquid first in the spring, and he was definitely the best member of that team. I'm actually really excited to see him play here because I'm really interested to see if he's going to step in and continue to be one of the more interesting top laners, kind of like he was last split, but wasn't necessarily there in the first series. That's okay. EG just kind of folded under the pressure, at least in this one for me, and so not a ton to really talk about. I'm just kind of disappointed with the consistency that this team has just continuously failed to find. And then for AoE, this is a really nice win. This should keep them, out of the bottom two at the very least this week, and I think it's definitely going to raise my opinion of them. Hopefully they can continue to be a good team moving forward. And now we get to move on to day number 2 here, the middle of the week in the NACL, and we got some really interesting games to talk about in the middle here, kicking us off with a matchup between Supernova and Maryville University, and I really think that this matchup in particular is very intriguing. I think these are two teams that at different points throughout the split have been kind of underwhelming in terms of what they've been able to put out, but both have started to kind of grow and find the players that they want to play through a little bit more consistently, and in this series, I honestly think both teams looked okay. It's going to be a 1-1 split from both. Player of the series for me is going to go to Trevor in the support position. Was just talking in the previous series about how Sketch and Trevor haven't really kind of exploded onto onto the scene and been as good of a bot lane as I was kind of anticipating. I thought that they were going to be the strong point of Supernova throughout this split, but it really has been Quacker on the top side, and obviously that was the case again. Go watch game number 1. It's another game that they played through Quacker, this time on the Darius, which was really, really fun to watch, but more consistently, I think throughout the entire series, it felt like Trevor was really good for this team, and he continues to be a really good engaged player. I think he's really good at controlling and corralling the pace of the game. Whether that means aggressive early games, or whether that means kind of biding his time and waiting until he can get to the point where he can play a little bit more aggro, I just think Trevor is a really good player overall. But like I said, Quacker was also really good for Supernova here. Music had a pretty good series. I think Robbie Bob was generally a little bit better in this series. Honestly, if I had to say anything, I think Supernova definitely looked like the better team in this series, which I did not expect, and it really makes things interesting, you know, talking about some of the teams near the bottom of the standings. If Supernova's going to start stepping up, then, man, that race for bottom 2 is going to be an incredibly difficult one for basically everybody involved. But good series overall for Supernova, definitely something we should be happy about. And then for Maryville, okay, like you're able to take a game. Game number 2 was pretty good. I think overall, when you're looking at the positives from game number 2, I'm mostly looking at Niles in the top lane. I'm looking at Scary Jerry in the bot lane, who was very consistent throughout this entire series, but a couple of misplays. I talked about Trevor being good. I think Zyko was a little bit worse in this one. He was probably the odd support out, if you will. I think Trevor was definitely the better support and was certainly more active in this series. And then my dud of the series is going to go to Odd Orange in the jungle. I thought he was relatively fine, but certainly not something that really stood out to me. I think the jungle matchup wasn't particularly in Maryville's favor. I think Music actually had a pretty good series overall, and Odd Orange had one of his weaker ones in quite a long time. I've been very, very positive about what Odd Orange has been able to do in the NACL this split. You're allowed to have one bad series. I'm not going to hold it against him, but he's going to get my dud of the series. Overall, kind of good for Supernova to be able to pick up a nice win here. It is 1-1, so it's not like they absolutely dominated or anything like that, but they walk out of this looking like the better team in their win, and I think that that's a good thing. Maryville still being able to pick up a win is a good thing as well. They're in a really good spot in terms of record-wise, and so they're going to be sitting pretty clean even after this. I don't necessarily think they played their best league of the year up until this point, but it was certainly good enough to be able to pick up the 1-1 draw. And then in the second series of this first slate of games, we had the Cincinnati Fear taking on Evil Geniuses challengers, and Fear's going to pick up another 2-0 series win. They have looked phenomenal at the start of this week. They've looked phenomenal in the recent weeks as well. Fear really are finding their groove, and Evil Geniuses, whatever groove that they had, whatever, you know, confidence and good play that they were having, it seems to have completely fallen off just like it did in the spring split. It feels almost inevitable that this team is going to underperform the talent level that they have at their disposal, but it continues to be a little bit of a problem for this team. But let's talk about Fear first and foremost. Just another really good series overall. Basically everybody on the team performing at a very high level. My player of the series is going to go to Perry, but I think you could give this to quite a few people. Perry was phenomenal in the jungle, and really it's obvious when Perry wins. He's one of those players where it's, you know, he just completely takes over the game, and he completely takes over the pacing and the map when he's able to generate a lead. This team is very, very aggressive when they get to play from ahead, as we get to see basically every single time they generate a lead like that, and Perry, I think, is a big reason for that. He's not afraid, once he has that lead, to just consistently make the enemy jungler's life a living hell, not let them play the game, and just kind of hope to strangle out resources, and I think he did that really, really well in this series. Super fun to watch. Love the very aggressive invades and things like that. I think Perry does a really good job of that, but Shochi continues to be a massive plus for this team. Those two have really gotten back to their spring form in terms of playing off of each other, I think, and it's very much helped out the team a ton. Shochi's just such a consistent fighter. Like, he really gives over no resources, and yet he is so effective at gaining resources for his team, which is actually astounding, right? Like, there aren't many players in the NACL that are as resourceless dependent as Shoji is, right? He doesn't need a lot of input, but will give you the same kind of output. So Perry was phenomenal. Shoji continues to be good. JJ, I think, has been really positive for this team, and Manui, I think, has gotten significantly more consistent as the split has gone on, which is good. The bot lane definitely was an area that we were looking to see step up a little bit more as we moved on in the summer split, and I think they've done that so far. Philip was fine, but again, like, very similar to their first series, I was a little bit more drawn to the enemy top laner than I was to Philip, which is fine so long as it doesn't become a problem, but it is something worth noting. Philip at one point in time was probably the best top laner in the NACL, so interesting to see. Maybe he's just not meshing with the team, but not really having the best of laning phases, so we'll see if that continues. I'm not exactly sure what to feel about him at the moment. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, a couple of positives, mostly negatives. Surdy is a positive for this team. Really good to see him come back and get another shot in the NACL. Like I said last split, I thought he was crazy underrated in terms of what he was outputting. Was a player like on a bottom team that I thought could actively go to almost any other team in the NACL and be a massive positive for them. And it's good to see him get another shot here on Evil Geniuses. I think he's probably been a little bit more active than Soul, at least in his first couple of series. And I thought he was pretty good in this one against Fear, but the rest of the map just simply did not hold up. Done of the series for me is going to go to Shaden. He just had another one of those series, right? When Shaden loses control, he plays so poorly from behind, and we got another kind of example of that happening here. Perry obviously is not a great opponent to go into if you're not great at playing from a deficit, because he will just strangle you out instantly and make it even more difficult, 9 times more difficult to play from that position. But Shaden, I think, continues to prove that that's already kind of a weakness of his, and I don't really see a lot of reason for that for me to expect that to change. And then, I've been hyping up King throughout a lot of the split, but he felt completely useless in this series. It really felt like he had no impact on the game overall. He wasn't involved in any of the positive plays. He was having quite a few negative plays himself, so this was probably King's worst series of the split up until this point. I still think he's been a major positive for Evil Geniuses overall, and definitely more so than I think people are giving him credit for, but this was probably not the series to showcase that. But overall, EG is starting to concern me. Like I said, this team now leads the entire NACL in losses, in terms of like 0-2 losses. Obviously not the worst individual game record, but, they now have 6 0-2 losses on the split, which is more than anybody else in the NACL. Not exactly what you want to see from a Challengers team, an LCS-affiliated team in the NACL, but these players just can't seem to get any sort of consistency together, and I think it definitely shows up in their gameplay. But for the Fear, they look really good. I mean, they're on fire right now, and it's because they got their aggression and their confidence back. When this team is feeling good and when they're pushing forward, they're a very difficult team to beat, and it really does feel like they have that confidence, they have that fire back, and clearly it's helping out a lot. I think this jungle mid duo was one of the best in the entire region. I think that they could probably go up to the LCS relatively soon and be relatively successful, and I think the rest of this team is more than good enough to be able to win with them. And so for Fear, if they can just keep this up, I again think they're going to be, I don't want to say the gatekeepers, but near a top team here, kind of separating the best from the worst in the NACL. And then moving on to our third series here, we had a matchup between Team Fish Taco and Disguised, and DSG is actually going to be able to pick up the 2-0 series win. This was something that they started to show in week number 3. We had been complaining about this team through the first 2 weeks of the split, not really being able to 2-0 a lot of series, having significantly too many 1-1s, even against teams that they absolutely should be beating with relative consistency. And lucky for us, it feels like they are starting to fix that problem. Obviously, we discussed it a little bit on day number 1 with their loss to FlyQuest Challengers, but here in day 2, they are able to take care of Taco, and I think that's really, really good to see. It's a 2-0, and I think basically everybody on the team played relatively well. The one player I definitely want to highlight, that I think everybody's going to want to highlight out of this series, is Tomio in the jungle. Now, there are some things to say about Tomio. I like him a lot as a player. He showed a lot of really good growth in the spring on Cloud9, as so many junglers do in that organization, but this is a player that had been relatively inconsistent, if we can remember ourselves back to 2022. When he was on Evil Geniuses, we were talking about him as a very feast or famine, a very aggressive jungler that when it works, it looks really good, and when it doesn't work, it looks really bad. And, he can still have those performances. I think that's been a little bit more common on DSG than it was on C9, but he was really good in this series. There was no negatives to really talk about in terms of Tomio. Just a phenomenal performance going into Taco, going into a team that I think really needed kind of a win here. They needed something to stabilize them, but they have a jungler that can be a little bit susceptible to more aggressive plays in Rosethorn, and so for Tomio to be able to come out and dominate it, it's not particularly surprising, but it is a good look, I would say, overall for him as a player. Even if Game 2 was relatively close, he was phenomenal in Game 2, and probably the reason that they walked away from that with a win. Bot lane was also really good. Criticized them quite a bit on day number 1, but they stepped up, and they were really, really solid in this one. They were going into a good bot lane. Spawn and NXI have been more than capable as an NACL bot lane throughout the year up until this point. Spawn in particular, a player that I really like. NXI is crazy aggressive in the support position, always looking for engage patterns, and it felt like Meech and Zazel actually had a really good series, and really, really impressed with what they were able to do. Meech, again, feels like a player that is going to capitalize a lot on the rest of the team performing well, and I think that when that is the case, he's going to look like one of the best AD carries in the NACL, and when it's not, he can be a little bit over-aggressive in terms of trying to get his team back into the game. I still really like Meech, but certainly something to keep in mind. This game does not exactly change my perception on that, if you will. But Zazel was also really good. Really like what Zazel's able to do. He's a really good player for this level. It's not like I'm breaking any ground by telling you that. Everybody on this team was good. Fake God and Young were also relatively fine. I just think Tomio and the bot lane were probably the most noticeably positive members for DSG in this nice 2-0 win. And then for Taco, a couple of positives. Really, there weren't a lot of major major negatives. Game number 2 was actually very, very close. A lot of that being because of Onat in the mid lane, who actually had a really good game on the Victor. Really fun to watch. I think he was actually probably the better mid laner in this series, even though I think Young performed relatively well. Onat was consistently playing super positive, was consistently pushing up and trying to play aggressive, keeping his team in the game. He was doing a lot of damage on that Victor pick, and I think you definitely got to give him a shout for that. I like Onat. I think he's shown some good things. Relatively inconsistent, but has been good when he's been able to kind of get off his feet, if you will, from the laning phase. And then there were some negatives, I would say, towards this team overall. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Lunacia in the top lane. I feel like I've done this to poor Lunacia a couple of times this split already, but he's only really getting dud of the split, or dud of the series, I should say, because there really weren't a lot of players on Taco that had, like, miserable series on their own. I mean, you can point to someone like NXI, who probably could have been a little bit more, like, clinical in terms of his execution, but I think overall, Lunacia was the one that I was noticing the least, and that's just going to happen. He had a great series earlier in the week, even in their loss on day number 1, and so really frustrating to just give him another dud of the series. It feels like he has way too many of these. Considering, like, his actual performance, I certainly don't think he's been as bad as, like, some of these recaps would lead you to believe. He has more good games, I would say, than bad ones. I think it's just the bad ones that end up standing out more, because when he plays poor, the rest of the team ends up playing poor as well, and so they end up losing, and it ends up being a negative, but Lunacia is going to get that. Like I said, I think you could give this to NXI, who didn't particularly play well, but like I said, Onat was really good. I don't think Rosethorn was particularly bad either, was certainly still active on the map and making plays, and then, you know, Spawn was trying his best. He really didn't make any major errors as the AD carry, and so it was just kind of a frustrating thing that I had to give it to someone, and, you know, definitely I think Taco overperformed in that game number 2. This is a team and an org that has definitely performed well against top-tier teams in the past, disguised, you know, chief among them back in week number 1, I believe, or maybe it was week 2, one of the two, but really interesting outcome here. I don't think Taco's going to take it too tough, but nice win for Disguised. Basically exactly what they wanted out of this series. And then moving on to series number 4 on day 2, we had a matchup between AoE Gold and Wildcard Gaming, and this one was another one that I was very intrigued to see because AoE had looked a lot better on day number 1 than I expected them, and Wildcard really have been kind of the best of the rest in terms of the non-top 3 teams in the NACL up until this point, and it is a 1-1 split. AoE actually looking really good in this series. Week number 4 has definitely been a positive one for this AoE team, and for a lot of these players. My player of the series for me personally is going to go again to Will in the jungle. This dude is actually cracked. I think he's so good in terms of what he's able to offer the NACL. I think, honestly, like, I don't mean to, I'm not going to bring down, like, his teammates, but I don't think the rest of AoE has performed all that well up until this point, this split. I've talked about it in previous weeks. I think Will has been a pretty consistent and constant positive for this team over the course of 2023 summer split, obviously coming back over, but it doesn't feel like Darkwings is having his best split. Lynx and Breezy have been okay. Breezy's been good, but Lynx has been inconsistent as a carry in the late game, and I certainly don't think the top side of the map with Concept has been a major positive for the team, so I've been really, really high on Will's ability to kind of keep this team in a lot of their games, but I didn't necessarily have a ton of upside for the team, but it really does feel like a lot of the main players on this team are getting their confidence back or playing with a lot more aggression than they were in previous games, and I think that's only going to be a positive for AoE moving forward. Will is still Will. He's still going to be one of the best junglers in the entire league, and he's still going to be a massive positive overall for them. But if you can have players like Darkwing step up like he did in this series, and like he did on day number 1, that's going to be massive. I've been a big fan of Darkwings over the course of his career, whether that's been in amateur or whether that's been, you know, in the NACL. I've been very vocal on this channel about how high I am on Darkwings, and so to see him start to get back into that form that we know he can be in is a major positive. But like I said before, Breezy has been very quietly phenomenal for this team all split long. Breezy consistently is one of those players that I just don't think is talked about highly enough. He's been one of the best supports in Academy, in the NACL for a long time for a variety of different organizations, and he's kind of been a mainstay, and it's for a reason. It's not because he's somebody who, you know, just isn't good enough for the LCS or anything. He's a very, very good player, and he has consistently helped a lot of teams into winning states, and I honestly think AoE, if they can get a lot of their pieces a little bit more consistent, can actually be one of the more interesting teams near the middle of the standings in the NACL. It just hadn't necessarily clicked into place before this week. So I know it's only a 1-1 and it feels like I'm talking about them super highly, but they were really good in this series, and I'm really happy to say that. And then for Wildcard, a couple of positives to take away as well. I really think Saligo is continuing to have a phenomenal split. Him and Keel together as a jungle mid duo is phenomenal, and they've been great. Will and Darkwings were great on the AoE side. Keel and Saligo were great on the Wildcard side. Both jungle mid duos, I think, really showed up in this series, and that's always going to be the biggest positive for Wildcard overall, is their ability to play consistently through that jungle mid duo. Keel is a great carry, Obviously, his main champion pool can be a little bit eclectic, but I really do think that he is a little bit more versatile than what people give him credit for. And then Saligo's just the pinnacle of consistency. He's a lot better when he gets to play for a really aggressive jungler like Keel, but he can carry games as well, which is what he did in game number 2. I honestly thought he was the best player for Wildcard again in this series. So good stuff overall. Some negatives to say for Wildcard, a few more than I would say for AoE. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Zamudo in the top lane. This is basically exclusively for game number 1, which was just utterly brutal on the Riven. I mean, that's a champion where you gotta really find the right matchup. Like, you gotta be in a situation where Riven can actually perform, and it didn't feel like it was the best situation for Riven, and Zamudo pulls it out and gets absolutely dumpstered on it, which is just never a good sign. It's gonna happen every once in a while, but, you know, Zamudo, a player that I think has definitely shown himself to be a little bit more volatile than maybe you would like out of the top lane role, and it could be something that causes Wildcard some problems the further we get into the split. And then Donbray, I thought, was relatively inconsistent in this series as well. I don't think Lens or Donbray were particularly good, but Donbray stood out, I think, a little bit more in terms of the negative plays, and so just things to keep in mind. But the jungle mid is still really good in terms of wildcard, and this team was, like, really, really rolling before this week, and so I'm not going to try and punish them too hard. It is worth noting their week 4 has not been as good as their weeks 2 and 3, but, you know, I think they'll be fine. I think they'll be able to bounce back and still be a really good team. And then for AoE on the other side, really, really good start to the week. Hopefully they can keep up this form as opposed to what they've shown at the beginning of the split, kind of the opposite of Wildcard, because what we see now is just really, really good. And then moving on to our final series of day number 2, and it's another banger involving FlyQuest. A couple of these this week. We had Team Liquid Challengers taking on FlyQuest Challengers. And it is going to be a 1-1 draw coming out from both of these top-tier teams. These might be the two single best teams in the entire region or in the entire league at the current moment, and that really is saying something. They're both really, really good, and they've both gotten so much more consistent, but really, FlyQuest in particular really impressed me in this series. They played the two best teams in the league leading up to this in the standings, and in a lot of people's power rankings in Disguised on day 1, Team Liquid on day 2, and they're walking out of this 3-1. That's pretty damn good coming in from a FlyQuest team that really wasn't looking all that consistent, at least in the previous couple weeks. So let's talk about it. The big emergence, it's a no-brainer. I mean, come on. Who else was I supposed to give player of the series to? It's going to go to Spirax. Of course it is. I mean, the dude went 17-1 on Azir in game number 2 here. He just absolutely dominated Team Liquid Challengers. Probably the single best team in the NACL. Of course he's going to get player of the series, and man, he has absolutely re-broken out here in week number 4, and that's the best case scenario for FlyQuest. I think if he is playing at like a top level, if he's going 17-1 on Azir in a game, like, this team's unstoppable. Like, they're the best team in the league if he starts playing like that. So really good stuff coming out from Spirax. You just got to be happy. We knew this was in him. He was a player who, I know I've said this about 1,000 times, and for those of you who watch my channel every single week, I'm so sorry you have to hear me say this every single week, but Spirax was a player who at the beginning of the year I was saying, this is my breakout guy. Like, this is the guy who's going to have a 2023 where he proves everybody, like, I'm the number 1, number 2 mid laner in the NACL, and I should be in the LCS. And that's what I really thought was going to happen. And it just didn't click in spring the way I expected it to, and it really wasn't clicking at the beginning of summer in the way that I expected it to, but week number 4, it's damn sure clicking now. The dude was absolutely ferocious. He was really, really good. Wasn't just him. I do think that there were a couple of players on Team Liquid that I liked, but we'll get into them in a little bit. I want to talk about Yuji, who continues to be playing really well, and this was probably the series that was the best for them as a duo, for Spirax and Yuji both, and I really think that's another really good sign overall for FlyQuest. When Yuji has really good games, and when Spirax has really good games, this team's going to be very difficult to beat. That was the weak point that I identified going into the split. If Yuji and Spirax were going to be able to step up, I felt like Masu and Winsome were the best bot lane in the NACL. I'm not exactly sure they are at this point, but they're certainly one of them at the very worst. Faisal was a major positive for Fear, and he again, you know, we'll talk about him as we get further along as well, but when Spirax and Yuji are stepping up, I think a lot of other things are going to start falling into place for FlyQuest, and I think this series was a little bit of an example of that. But for TL on the other side, they dominated game number 1. It wasn't just FlyQuest dominating, right? This was Team Liquid playing well in that same vein. Both of these teams, I think, come out of this series looking relatively good. I think player of the series could have very realistically gone to a couple of people. I very nearly gave it to Mir in the jungle for TL, who I think, you know, has very, very much proven that he's the best jungler in the NACL at the current moment. He's just so consistent in terms of his early pathing and being able to generate leads for his laners and for himself. It's just astounding how good he has been. I didn't expect him to be this good good. I thought he was going to be an average, jungler moving into the league. We've seen some players from, I don't want to say from minor regions, but, we've seen some players come in from Oceania, and we've seen some players come in from, Latin America, and some of these other regions that aren't quite as dominant, right? And they've come into NA Academy, and they haven't gotten off the ground as quickly as possible. Now, that's kind of not been always true. There's been some players from Turkey that have come in and been really good, et cetera, et cetera. But Mir coming in, I think, has completely been the best jungler from day one. And it's really, really fun to watch. He's been great. I think APA had a good series, even though Spirax also had a good series. That game number 1 from APA was a lot of fun to watch. And I think Kim Down played really well. I was critical of him on day number 1. I thought he was much better here on day number 2. I do have to be critical of a couple of players. And so dud of the series for me is going to go to Bradley on the side of Team Liquid. But honestly, give this to Bradley or Faisal. They both played equally as bad in their respective losses. Game number 1, Faisal was miserable. Game number 2, Bradley was miserable in the exact same matchup. And so very weird stuff coming out from both of the top laners, but one got the upper hand in one game and the other just absolutely got decimated in the other. But I don't think anybody on the bottom side of the map really played poorly at all for either team. There was no real criticisms that I had from jungle to support for either of these two teams. And so unfortunately, because of that, it feels like one of the top laners is going to have to get done of the series. And for me, Bradley's game was a little bit more disappointing on the Kennen. I really did feel like that matchup was relatively good for him, especially after he dominated it in game number 1. So to see him have such a bad game in game number 2 really wasn't all that great for me. But I think you could give this to Faisal, and I think both top laners really weren't in the best form in week number 4, which is certainly something to keep in mind. But both of these teams are fantastic. This is very likely a matchup between the two best teams in the NACL at the current moment, and I think we got really, really lucky to see maybe a preview of potential NACL finals here in week number 4. And then moving on to our third and final day here in the NACL in week number 4. And I really do appreciate you guys sticking with me through this. I hope you guys are enjoying the content. But kicking off our third and final day was a matchup between Maryville University and Evil Geniuses Challengers that EG is going to be able to take 2-0. That means they played 6 games this week, or 3 series, and all 3 of them were 2-0s. 2 of them they lost, 1 of them they won. So high variance from this EG team, and I would expect nothing less with what they were able to do in spring. This is basically the same formula that they had in spring, where they would either 2-0 you and look really good doing it, or they would lose 0-2, and they'd look pretty miserable doing it. But the inconsistencies and the ups and downs, that's what makes this team kind of fun to watch, and it's kind of what builds their identity. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to King in the bot lane, who, you can say a lot of things about Evil Geniuses, you can say a lot of things about this team, but King has been phenomenal for them, and I'm not going to go, super far, in terms of talking about him and, trying to overhype what his performances have been, because I know a lot of people aren't as high on him as I am, but watching these games, he's maybe been the most impressive AD carry in the summer split. Not saying he's individually been the best, because I think that's a very difficult conversation to have only halfway through the split, but in terms of, what I was expecting versus what I got, King has arguably been the best, and I don't think a lot of people were kind of expecting that going into this split. He's been hyper consistent as a carry. He's getting a lot of recognition from a lot of his peers, and I think it's very deserved. King is the backbone of this Evil Geniuses team, and a lot of their wins, if not almost all of their wins, have come off the back of King. Now, wasn't the only one who played well. You got to give a lot of credit to Smoothie in that bot lane as well. I haven't exactly been nearly as high on Smoothie. I do think that King, playing with King helps him a lot, but Smoothie still has been inconsistently good for this team. There have been good games, and especially towards the beginning of the split when this team was looking a lot better, I think Smoothie was having some pretty solid performances there. He just hasn't been able to keep it up all the time, but this was a good series against Maryville, and then Ryoma had a good series. He has good series whenever this team wins. It's just what he does. When he plays well, they often win, and when he doesn't play well, they often lose. Not to say that, sometimes they don't lose when he plays well, because that has definitely been the case over the course of this split, but Ryoma did have a very good series, and I think topside was solid as well. Shaden, not necessarily a focal point, but didn't make any major mistakes either, which is really all that you need from him at this point. And I thought Surdy was definitely the better top laner in this series. Still really like him. And so King's continuing to carry this Evil Geniuses team and continues to be a major focal point that basically every team that plays against them has to worry about constantly. And so good stuff from him. But for Maryville, come on. You were looking so good. You looked so consistent, and now you're losing to Evil Geniuses. This is definitely not what I wanted to see. I wanted to see this team really come out and honestly 2-0 EG. That really would have solidified where Maryville was in the power rankings and in the standings for me, but not being able to get the job done here is incredibly frustrating. My dud of the series is going to go to Zyko in the bot lane. Bot lane in general was obviously very EG favored across this entire series. King and Smoothie just did a great job of being able to generate a lot of pressure, and Zyko was just not having a very good day overall. I don't think anyone on Maryville was really stepping up. Game 2 was significantly more close than game number 1, but still, there should have been a lot of situations where they played significantly more aggressive. And I think Zyko had one of his worst series of the split up until this point, which is definitely at least a little bit disappointing. And then you've got Niles. He's the other player that I want to point out, just not having a particularly great series. That's a little bit of a problem for Maryville. We've seen some top laners not be super consistent over the course of this split. You know, I think top lane in particular is the role that most gets hampered by the way that I do player of the game or player of the series and dud of the series, etc. Especially in the NACL and best of 2 format, because it's just very difficult, you know, when you get like a 1-1 draw or anything like that for top lane to not be polarizing. Usually, at least in one game where you lose, the top lane's not going to look great, but if you're looking across 2 games, usually jungle through support are going to have some moments across those 2 games where it's sometimes less likely to have a top laner. I think Niles has kind of suffered from that. This is one of the few teams that I think really does rely on their top laner to win a lot, and so he kind of gets a little bit graded harshly because of that, and I'm not going to give him dud of the series here. I think Zyko was significantly less impactful for the team overall, but worth noting that top and support, I think, weren't particularly good for Maryville. But like I said, they really should have won this. It would have built a lot of confidence for me. I really wanted to see them be able to do it. Unfortunately, they're not able to pull it out here. Hopefully, they're going to be able to rebound from this because they were really on a nice high, basically going one-on-one or 1-for-1 with everybody else in the league. But for EG, they desperately needed a win like this to kind of reassert themselves. But Maryville is now one of the only teams that they've actually been able to 2-0 the entire year. They've now done it twice. And so very interesting that the matchup ends up going that way, but I'm not going to completely forget about EG's inconsistencies because of it. And then you want to talk about a shocking outcome, a shocking result. Our second series here of day 3, we had Wildcard Gaming taking on Team Liquid Challengers, and Wildcard taking the 2-0 series win, not dropping a single game to what a lot of people consider to be the best team in the NACL. Not exactly the best week for Team Liquid, if we're being entirely honest. This was a team that came into the week completely rolling, not really dropping any games, let alone any series. This is their first 0-2 of the entire summer split, and I did not see this one coming. Wildcard honestly wasn't in the best form that they had been all split long going into the series. So for them to be able to walk out of this with a 2-0 win and looking really good and definitely like the better team in both of these games, it's just incredibly surprising and really good for Wildcard. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me, it's got to go to Keel. We can't ignore him anymore. It is just impossible to ignore him. He has been so good over the course of this split. In my opinion, he's been the best jungler in the NACL. I think him and Mir, you know, the 2 junglers in this series are the 2 that kind of have the biggest argument for that, at least in terms of performance this split, but a lot of that does come down to opinion. You know, I still would probably take Mir as a player on my team, but Keel has been phenomenal over the course of this split, and this series kind of put that into perspective. He went up against Mir, and honestly, he played phenomenal. He was really the better jungler across this series, which I just would not have expected going into it. So to see Keel continue to step up and really not drag Wildcard, because the rest of this team played well, which we'll get to, but really push Wildcard across the finish line, it's just really, really good stuff from him and from this team in general. The other players to shout out, Zamudo in the top lane. What a performance from him. We talked about him being very feast or famine. Well, half of feast or famine is feast, and that was definitely what he did in this series, is he was fantastic in the top lane. Really good game number 1 from him. Both games were good on the Rumble. Just a really, really fun kind of composition. Obviously, we'll talk about him, but Saligo, 2 games on the Sejuani mid lane is really, really fun. And so this was just a wild composition. And I think especially the top side of the map really performed. I think Keel, Zamudo definitely stepped up. But you also got to give a lot of credit to Lens, who was playing mostly weak side in the bot lane, not really getting as many resources as maybe he was intending to get. And I think he was definitely the better AD carry. We'll get to Arrow, but I don't think he had a particularly good series here against Wildcard. Honestly, Wildcard showed up and were just kind of better than Team Liquid. They outskilled them in lane. They were able to translate those leads into mid-game pressure, and they closed it out relatively efficiently. These were just 2 really good games from a good Wildcard team, and at this point, we really do have to start taking this team incredibly seriously. And then for TL on the other side, it's unfortunate. Like, this week really wasn't their best. 2 1-1s and then an 0-2 is not exactly the week that you expected. 2 and 4 is definitely not what Team Liquid would have expected coming out of week number 4, but I do think that there are some things to at the very least keep in mind. I don't think that anybody played particularly well in this series in particular, but I don't know, players like Mir didn't exactly look awful. I don't think APA looked particularly bad in this series. Little did he know, of course, it would be his final series in the NACL, but I think that there are definitely some players that we have to point out that, and just say that they didn't have very good weeks, quite frankly. Arrow and Kim Down didn't have particularly good weeks, quite frankly. The bot lane just wasn't nearly up to the standard that they had set for themselves at the beginning of the split. Now, this has happened before with Arrow and Kim Down. Last split, we had some really good performances at the beginning, and then they just kind of became okay as the split went on. They picked it back up again for playoffs, which was super important for their run into top 3, but I'm not exactly sure that that's going to be able to be a replicable thing. It'll definitely be interesting. And then another player who had a shockingly bad week was honestly Bradley in the top lane, who's going to get my dud of the series here. Just kind of a poor performance overall. Zamudo was awesome on the Rumble across this entire series, and Bradley just couldn't really keep up. And that was kind of the theme for Bradley this week. He's a really good player, and he was awesome in week number 3. He was very close to being my player of the week in the NACL in the previous week, and so I'm not going to harp on it too much. It's just kind of interesting to see Bradley have a little bit of a rough week for Team Liquid here, something to definitely keep in mind. But, Arrow, Kim Down, Bradley, these are players that are experienced and have won a lot at this level, and I would expect to be able to figure things out, especially with Mir and, this coaching staff kind of surrounding them to be able to get them back on the same page. It's just a matter of time before Team Liquid can go back to kind of dominating a lot of these other teams. I'm going to take the series a little bit with a grain of salt because as good as Wildcard is, this is really not an expected outcome. And, for Wildcard, you probably need to look at it that way as well. It's great that you were able to do this, but continuing to build off the confidence and the momentum that you were able to generate here and continue to get better as the split goes on is going to be incredibly important towards sustaining this kind of level of success. And then moving on to our third series, or our first series of the second slate, if you really want to look at it like that. We had AoE Gold taking on Disguised, and it is a 1-1 split. Back to the regular for DSG here, back to the 1-1 split, but AoE honestly continuing to look really good. They looked really good the entirety of this week number 4, and it was basically exactly what we wanted to see from a team that really hadn't looked all that good in the couple of weeks before that, so really, really happy for them. But Disguised still showing up. It wasn't like they got completely run over or anything. This was still a really good performance coming out from DSG, and that's exactly, I think, what you were looking for in a situation like this. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Meech in the bot lane. Good stuff coming out from Meech. Really like the back half of this week for him. Obviously, wasn't perfect on day number 1, but days 2 and 3 were really good for this bot lane for DSG. And again, it just kind of plays into this archetype that I really have painted in my own head, and I really do think is accurate about Meech and just about this DSG bot lane in their current state, which is that there are going to be some games where they look really good, and when they get a lot of resources and when they're able to play with that high tempo and kind of push the game forward, they're going to look fantastic. Meech is going to look like the best AD carry in the NACL, but it's just not always going to be like that. Not every game state is going to fall into a way where Meech is going to be able to take over in the same way that he was able to take over in this one. So still really good stuff. I think obviously playing with Zeyzal helps him out a ton. Zeyzal's just a really good player and is still really good for this level, and I think those two playing together has definitely made Meech at least a little bit more consistent, has been able to get some of the mechanical talent and just the upside out of Meech that we all knew was there, that we've all seen from him over the past couple of years, but this was a really good series coming out from him. Not to disparage his opponents. We'll talk about Lynx in a second, who was also fantastic in this series, but Meech was just a little bit better in my opinion. And then you've got Zeyzal. Of course, you got to bring up Zeyzal being a major positive factor for the team overall. Him and Meech are really developing a great chemistry, and I think Zeyzal's kind of balance between control and aggression is really, really good. I think that's one of the biggest positives that I give to him, is that he knows how to play like a weak side control style. He did it for a long time on Cloud9 when he was on the main roster, and he still knows how to play aggressive. He still knows how to be a main initiator for the team, and he knows how to try and make plays happen in that same vein as well. So just positives coming out from him. Meech and Zeyzal were both really good, but a couple of things to point out on the side of DSG that weren't quite as fantastic. Young in the mid lane, to me, just wasn't phenomenal, right? Just a couple of meh performances coming out from Young. I want to see him step up and really be that mid laner that we all know he can become. He hasn't necessarily been that as consistently as we would like on DSG, and I think that was kind of the big negative, but everybody else on the team was relatively fine. I think Meech and Zeyzal were definitely the standouts, but DSG was good overall. And then for AoE, I should say, on the other side, another couple of really big positives for the team. Gotta start with Will. How can I not start with Will? The dude has been absolutely phenomenal all week and basically all split for AoE. Really, his only negative performances has been when he was subbing in at AD carry, a position that he doesn't necessarily play all that much, but still really good stuff coming in from him. He was a big positive in their win in game number 2. And then Lynx. Lynx was also really solid in this game, and Lynx was someone who I was very high on towards the back half of last year. I thought he continuously started to improve as the split went on in spring, so I was really happy to see him retained here for AoE, and I think his partnership with Breezy has been a major good thing for him as a player and for this team as a whole. I think both of those players have stepped up. Breezy, obviously, I've talked about a ton on this channel, but Lynx has been good too. And so just good stuff overall from the AoE bot lane and from the AoE jungler, who I do think were the positives. But dud of the series for me is going to go to Concept in the top lane. you know, I really don't want to rag on him because he's a good enough player, right? Like, and I know I might be a little bit lower on consistency, and unfortunately for Concept, he's just not a very consistent top laner. He's gonna have some really bad games every once in a while, but topside's been a little bit of a problem for AoE, as it kind of was for Golden Guardians Academy or Challengers last split, as it kind of was for you know, Golden Guardians and Immortals when he previously was playing. So Concept at this point, I don't have a ton of confidence that he's going to be like a PowerPoint on the map for the team. I don't think he's a disaster. He got a lot of consistency down towards the back half of last split when Golden Guardians was trying to make that run into playoffs. He really wasn't losing all that much in the top lane. He wasn't exactly winning, but he wasn't getting demolished either, and that's usually good enough. We've talked about that a ton, but this was just another example of a not particularly good series, and Concept has these relatively frequently. It's just kind of unfortunate, but it's the situation that we find ourselves in. Overall, I think both teams looked relatively good. Like I said, Meech, Zazel, Will, Lynx, they were the 4 big standouts for me, but a lot of other players I think played relatively well. I think both teams walk out of this feeling good, and maybe DSG was looking at a 2-0. Maybe that was something that they were kind of expecting here, but AoE's been playing really well this week, and so I think both teams are going to feel pretty good walking away with this 1-1. And then our 4th series of this 3rd day was a matchup between 2 teams that are kind of in the bottom 2 right now, so definitely both need to step up. We had Team Fish Taco taking on Supernova, and it was a 1-1 draw. And again, not particularly surprising, neither of these teams have really been able to separate themselves from the pack so far this split, but both are sitting in relatively poor spots in terms of their actual game scores, and they really needed a couple wins in order to step it up. Lucky for them, both of them got one here, but I think both teams probably were really looking for 2-0s to kind of solidify their spot above the other in the standings. It just was unfortunate that neither were able to get it. I think both games were relatively impactful by the individual players, but game 1 was definitely the one that I think is going to stand out a lot more in people's minds. Taco's win was utterly demolishing, and I really do think a lot of their players ended up playing well, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, no brainer for me, has got to go to Onat. What a series from Onat. He was honestly really good towards the back half of this week, very similar to what I just said about Meech, where day 1 wasn't exactly his best work, although I don't think it really was all that bad. On day number 1, he was just kind of the worst player on Taco, if you will, but days 2 and 3 were phenomenal from him, even if the rest of this team wasn't exactly living up in the same exact way. So big credit to Onat. Like I said earlier, I think he's been pretty solid here at the NACL level. I don't think he's been a superstar. He hasn't been like a top 4, you know, ish mid laner in the league, which I think is kind of tough competition at the current moment with how good a lot of these mid laners are, but I do think he's been more than playable in terms of being like a team that could make playoffs, right? Mid lane is such a massive position in the current meta. It's so important for mid lane to be kind of a power point that you can play through, and I think Onat can be a player like that at this level, and I think he's shown that. Game number 1 was just phenomenal from him. Spawn was also terrific in that first game. You know, they just kind of demolished Supernova. They just kind of ran them over, and I think a lot of gold ended up going into the 2 carry roles, and that was definitely indicative by their score lines, but NXI did a great job, I think, facilitating a lot of that as well, so bot lane definitely getting some kudos and some shouts from me, but that's kind of been the trend for Taco. When you look at the players that we're consistently bringing up, it's players like Lunacia, Lunacia had a good series. I certainly don't want to say that he had a bad series, but it's Onat. It's, you know, sometimes the bot lane, it's mostly Spawn, right? NXI will have games here or there that he looks good because of the aggression, but, you know, Rosethorn continues to be a question mark. I'm not saying he had a bad series or anything like that, but game 2 was definitely questionable, and I still don't think he's had enough standout performances to really make me believe in that same way, so that's something I'm going to try to keep an eye on, but everybody else was pretty good in this series for Taco, and I definitely think they're going to be happy about that. And then for Supernova on the other side, game 1 was utterly miserable for them. They got absolutely steamrolled, especially this bot lane. And, you know, we'll talk about it. Dud of the series is going to go to Trevor, but you could give this to Sketch. I mean, both were miserable in the game number 1, and that's really what they're getting this Dud of the series for. But in game number 2, they were at least a little bit better, and Supernova in general looked a lot better in game number 2, mostly led by Music in the jungle, who I think had a relatively okay series overall. I don't think Robbie Bob was particularly awful either. I think Jungle Mid, again, on the side of Supernova, was probably the avenue that they played through the most in that second game to be able to generate their win, but Music, I think, did a pretty good job of being able to set the tempo and then just not really give up a ton of pressure. In the mid game, I think, of course, Trevor and Sketch were definitely questionable in this series. I think Spawn and NXI were definitely the better bot lane in terms of the 2 teams. Game number 1 was a shellacking. I think Spawn was like 1-7, and I think Trevor was like 0-8. Something like that, like a miserable game coming out from both of them, but they definitely were better in terms of their performances in the second one. I'm going to give it to Trevor because I think those engages in game number 1 were just so bad. He was so consistently caught out, but again, you want to give it to the 1-7 sketch at AD carry, like absolutely, I totally understand what you're going for there, and I totally agree, and like I said earlier, I'm shocked that the bot lane of Supernova is kind of becoming the part of the team that I'm the least confident in, because that was the part of the team that I was the most confident in moving into the split. Music's been pretty good for this team. I think Quacker has definitely been a positive. Robbie Bob has had his ups and downs. He's definitely been a little bit more up and down than expected, but bot lane has really not been able to connect ever since week 1 was pretty good for them, and so definitely going to be interesting to see how things move from there, but a 1-1 for both of these teams. It's not the end of the world for either of them, but both of them are going to need to get their shit into gear, quite frankly, if they want to start moving up the standings. Remember, bottom 2 don't make playoffs, and both of these teams are definitely in danger of being in those spots, so a big series here, but it is going to end in a 1-1 for both. And then moving on to our final series of the week, we had another really intriguing matchup. FlyQuest really had no easy matchups this week. We had Cincinnati Fear taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and it's another 1-1 draw. Fly coming out of the week 4-2, but it's against 3 of the best teams in the entire league. 3 of definitely the top 5 teams in the entire league at the very worst. And Fear, honestly, might not be number 5 anymore with the way that they're currently playing. Of course, Wildcard's still playing really well. We'll get to the power rankings at the end, but both teams continuing to look really good. And this kind of just caps off both teams having a really good week, if I'm being entirely honest. They each got a game to shine, almost in identical fashion. And so let's go ahead and talk about it, because I do really like the way that both teams ended up performing. My player of the series is going to go to Masu onto FlyQuest. I think that game 1 from him was just so impressive, and it was my favorite individual performance of the series, and so I'm going to go ahead and give him player of the series. I also think he was rather consistent. I think when you look, it's funny, I'll get to the mid laners, but each mid laner had one really good game and one really bad game, which is really funny considering I think both of them have been on, pretty big upticks recently, and so really interested to see that. But Masu was very consistent, even in their loss. He really was not a big problem for them, and I thought he was a major asset, probably the most important player in that game number 1 win, and so he's going to get my player of the series. Really happy to see him get this. This was someone who I'm not going to say I was worried about, but he was like a non-stop major presence in spring. We were consistently talking about him every single game. Every single FlyQuest game was entirely around Masu. MVP hype, even though he missed some parts of the split. Like, he was that damn good for the team. I had him as my number 180 carry going into the split. It really just felt like he was destined to be an LCS bot laner by the beginning of next year. But it hasn't exactly been as explosive, I would say, in summer. Not that he has been bad at all. He's had a couple of lesser consistent performances, but I think overall he's still been really good for this team, and hopefully he's kind of getting back into that form. If you can get Masu and Winsome to really step up, I mean, Winsome's already been that guy. For me, he's been the best support in the NACL this split, but if you can get Masu on that train and continue to have him, kind of get back into that form that he was on in spring, like, that's going to be absurd. Like, this bot lane's still going to be untouchable, just like we all thought they would be at the beginning of the split. So, Masu playing well. Of course, Winsome continues to play well. The dude has been phenomenal the entire split. Winsome's the best support in the NACL. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate at the current moment. He's just so active all the time on the map. He's so good in lane. He's good out of lane. He just does everything that you want him to do. I don't know how vocal or not vocal he is. That's really the only question mark when it comes to Winsome, is whether or not he's a great communicator, and there's really nothing that I've heard for or against that in terms of his reputation, but like on the Rift, he does absolutely everything that you could ever want a support to do. So Winsome's a huge positive. I think UG had another really good series, but it just continues to be good things. Unfortunately, I do have to give dud of the series to somebody, and so I'm going to give it to Faisal in the top lane. Unfortunate to do that when he's going up against his former team here in the Cincinnati Fear. I really don't even think he played all that poorly. He was relatively fine for FlyQuest. He was actually pretty good in their win and relatively irrelevant in their loss, but I'm going to be honest, most players in this series were good. Like, this was one of those series where dud of the series doesn't really apply to an individual player. It just, everybody was fine in their own little moment, in their own pocket that they got to shine in, and so, I'm going to give it to Faisal. I think you could realistically give it to either mid laner for their individual performances in games 1 and 2, but they were both so good in their wins, and so it's really hard to do that as well. But overall, I think FlyQuest looked really good, and I think Fear also looked really good in their win in game number 2. A lot of really big positives to take away from them there. Perry continued to be really good across this entire series. He has very quickly regained that ascension into being one of the best junglers in the NACL again. He's just so aggro. He's so willing to, punish mistakes more so than I think almost any other jungler in the region, that it's really fun to watch. Yuji's kind of built in a similar mold. I think both of them are very similar players, but I think Perry is someone someone who has just shown it for a longer period of time. Yuji might be a little bit more explosive in this split in particular, and certainly a little bit more consistent, but I think both of these junglers had really good series, especially in their wins. And then, like I said, Shochi was good in game number 2. He was bad in game number 1, just as Spearex was really good in game number 1, and was really bad in game number 2. It's gonna happen every once in a while. Manui and JJ were relatively fine, and so was Philip on the top side. Honestly, there really weren't a lot of big negatives to give to Fear. I just feel like both teams definitely showed off a lot of the positives that we had been looking for from both of them, and they're both, I think, going to be walking out of this feeling relatively happy with everything that ended up working out. Fear really cementing themselves as an upper echelon team, being able to take a game off of FlyQuest, who has looked fantastic across the whole week. 2-0 DSG took a game off of Team Liquid. A lot of really nice accomplishments for FlyQuest, and Fear came in on a massive hot streak, 4-0 going into the week, and only dropped one game, a 5-1 week for Fear. That's just about as good as you could possibly ask for them overall, and they're going to continue to climb up the power rankings and be a major team to watch out for. I know people are talking about them as like the, placeholders, I guess, if you will. Like, I want to... That's disrespectful in my eyes. It's not fair to say that they're just going to be the separators between the bottom and the top teams in the league. I very much feel like they could absolutely be a top team in the league, and they're kind of on the pace to be that, and I think they really performed up to that standard, at least in week number 4. And then for FlyQuest, just really good. Like, they're a really good team. They could potentially be the best team in the NACL at the current moment, what with how they showed against Team Liquid, and with Liquid kind of struggling against Wildcard right now. But Fly's just really, really fun to watch. If Masu and Winsome can get back on board, if they can be one of the better bot laners, and then, if Yuji and Spearex can continue to grow, if Faisal can kind of find his form in the top lane, like, this team could be relatively unstoppable in playoffs should everything go right. So really happy to see both teams walk out of this series probably feeling good. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 4 overview and analysis of all 15 series across the 3 days. Up on your screen now, you're going to see the Week 4 standings. The standings at the end of week number 4. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. We're at the point where it's just one left here. Let's go ahead and go over the risers and the fallers in my power rankings, which you will find in the first column to the right, in the second column to the right. You're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. Really not a lot of changes. I feel like a lot of things are going as according to plan in the NACL at the current moment, or I'm taking a more wait-and-see approach. I think top 5 is super solidified at the moment. Team Liquid is going to stay at number 1, even though they didn't have the best of weeks, but I still have to believe that they're going to be able to figure things out. DSG and FlyQuest are going to stay at 2 and 3, but they are going to flip around, and so FlyQuest going to be jumping up to number 2, DSG going to be falling down to number 3. I think FlyQuest looked better. Obviously, the 2-0 this week was really good, but if FlyQuest was able to jump up to number 1 in the upcoming weeks, I'm not going to be entirely surprised. They looked really good across the entirety of this week. Wildcard staying at number 4. This team is getting dangerously close to being able to enter that top 3 or that top 2 with that win over Team Liquid. I think a lot of people are putting them there right now. And then Fear at number 5, a team that I really do want to put higher, but right now there's just so many good teams in the NACL, and it feels like top 5 is just so contested. I say that, top 5 you can put in a lot of different orders, but those are your top 5, and then the bottom 5 to me are also pretty locked. Moving up quite a bit to number 6 is going to be AoE Gold, a really good week from them. I'm hoping that they're going to be able to sustain it, and honestly, with the talent on this team, I think they are going to be able to. Will is playing out of his mind. I think Darkwings is a really good player. Breezy's a really good player. Lynx is a solid player. I think there's a lot of talent on AoE, and so moving them up to number 6 feels pretty good with how they were able to perform this week. Maryville's going to stay at number 7. Evil Genius is going to fall to number 8. I just don't believe in this team's consistency. Yes, that win over Maryville was awesome, but I just don't know how many times they're going to be able to do that, and that means Taco and Supernova are going to be my bottom 2 at the current moment. The draws against each other absolutely did not help towards the back half of this week, and so they're going to be number 9 and 10 respectively. But let me know what you guys' thoughts are down in the comment section below. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions. Your list is not going to be the same as mine, so I'd love to hear you guys' opinions as well, as long as, of course, they are constructive. But time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 4 in the NACL, and my player of the week was a pretty interesting choice. I'm going to go ahead and give it to Spearex, the mid laner for FlyQuest Challengers. He was awesome across this entire week. A lot of really fun games, especially in the first 2 days, but he was still really good in game number 1 for FlyQuest against Fear as well. 5 of the 6 games, he utterly dominated this weekend. That definitely has to be taken into account. Just a really big bounce back from him. We've really been waiting on this, and I think he absolutely delivered. The other player I was considering was Will on AoE Gold, who I thought also played incredibly well this week, but I think I have to give it to Spearex. He was just too much of a standout player in my eyes. And then Dud of the week for week number 4. Unfortunately, weren't a lot of like super good options this week, and so I'm gonna give it to a pretty big surprise player. I'm gonna give it to Bradley, the top laner for Team Liquid Challengers, who I really didn't think had a particularly great week. Obviously, I think that there's a lot that he can do to continue to get back onto that path. He's more than talented enough, and you're allowed to have a bad week every once in a while, especially in the top lane, where I think it's just super volatile, especially in the NACL, where so many players play to win lane. But, you know, just not a great week for Bradley, and hopefully he's going to be able to figure it out. So, week number 4, Dud of the week is going to go to Bradley. Week number 4, player of the week is going to go to Spirax, but that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the NACL every single week on this channel, going over everything, but not only that, we cover all 4 of the major regions every single week on this channel as well, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything happening in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit the subscribe button and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all